أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم من همزه ونفخه ونفثه بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Let's get started with some checking questions. So, how are you? How was your weekend? How does having a purpose in life, if you have one, help simplify your decision making and planning? In other words, how does having meaning and purpose in life help you make decisions that help you make decisions that then facilitate for you I guess a little bit more contentment and less stress. That's the negative kind. So there's a positive stress. There's also the negative one, which in terms of depending on how you frame it, right? Stress can be good or bad. But how can having purpose in life positively impact your life overall? These are some of the same questions as last time. I took away some of the earlier ones, or some of the in the beginning ones, but then I added some in bold. So how does meaning or purpose in life help with contentment? What kind of purpose must it be? So there's just because I mentioned purpose, it doesn't mean that we're on the same page in terms of what purpose is, right? In this case, what kind of purpose are we talking about over here? Just what are the different aspects of purpose? What are the required aspects of purpose for contentment to be achieved, or happiness to be achieved, or calm to be achieved, and so on? If there is that connection between purpose and all that stuff, right? So what kind of purpose must there be, and what kind of purpose obviously cannot be, or should it not be, for it to be sustainable? So I'll give you like a few seconds to kind of just review this and to look at the new questions, and then we'll move forward from there, inshallah. Okay. Let's review. Again, just keep in mind, we mentioned all of this in the beginning, and right now all the stuff that we're showing, see how that connects to all of these things. So having these things in mind in the beginning, and then kind of getting sort of confirmations for all of these things. Imagine like having that clarity from the very beginning. If we have that clarity in the very beginning when it comes to Islam, for example, then we don't need to necessarily understand how it works or why it works and stuff, as long as we understand that it works. So sometimes if you know the source is correct and it's good and beneficial, then you can just take it without having to fully understand every detail aspect of how it works and why it works and so on, because otherwise we limit ourselves in our own progress as individuals and as communities and societies and so on. So just some things to keep in mind over here. There is this false notion of things about like how we must understand something before we are gonna accept it or whatever, but that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. Right? We can accept things if they're functionally beneficial and so on, even if we don't fully understand how they work or why they work and stuff like that. So just keep that in mind as a rule that we can live by. All right, so pick one.
Left.
Okay. So this is addressing one of the things that people have sort of mentioned, that you can't grow new brain cells and stuff, and your brain dies and stuff, your brain cells die and stuff, that's it, and so on. But then the science is actually showing that that's not actually the case. Your brain can actually neurons.
Can we, as adults, grow new nerve cells? There's still some confusion about that question, as this is a fairly new field of research. For example, I was talking to one of my colleagues, Robert, who is an oncologist, and he was telling me, Sandrine, this is puzzling. Some of my patients that have been told they are cured of their cancer still develop symptoms of depression. And I responded to him, well, from my point of view, that makes sense. The drug you give to your patients that stops the cancer cells multiplying also stops the newborn neurons being generated in their brain. And then Robert looked at me like I was crazy and said, but Sandrine, these are adult patients. Adults do not grow new nerve cells. And much to his surprise, I said, well, actually, we do. And this is a phenomenon that we call neurogenesis. So now Robert is not a neuroscientist. And when he went to medical school, he was not taught what we know now, that the adult brain can generate new nerve cells. So Robert, being a good doctor he is, wanted to come to my lab to understand a little bit better the topic. And I took him for a tour of one of the most exciting parts of the brain when it comes to neurogenesis. And this is the hippocampus. So this is this gray structure in the center of the brain. And what we know since already very long is that this is important for learning and memory and mood and emotion. However, what we have learned more recently is that this is one of the unique structure of the adult brain where new neurons can be generated. And if we slice through the hippocampus and zoom in, what you actually see here in blue is a newborn neuron in an adult mouse brain. So when it comes to human brain, my colleague Jonas Friesen from the Karolinska Institute has estimated that we produce 700 new neurons per day in the hippocampus. So you might think this is not much according to the billions of neurons we have, but by the time we will turn 50, we will have all exchanged the neurons we were born with in that structure with adult-born neurons. So why are these new neurons important and what are their functions? So first, we know that they're important for learning and memory. And in the lab, we have shown that if we block the ability of the adult brain to produce new neurons in the hippocampus, block certain memory abilities. And this is especially new and true for spatial recognition. So like how you navigate your way in the city. So we're still learning a lot, and they are not only important for memory capacity, but also for the quality of the memory. And they will have been helpful to add time about memory, and they will help differentiate very similar memory. Like, how do you find your bike that you park at the station every day in the same area, but in a slightly different position? And more interesting to my colleague Robert is the research we have been doing on neurogenesis and depression. So in animal model of depression, we have seen that they have a lower level of neurogenesis. And if we give antidepressants, then we increase the production of these newborn neurons, and we decrease the symptom of depression, establishing a clear link between neurogenesis and depression. But moreover, if you just block neurogenesis, then you block the efficacy of the antidepressant. So by then, Robert had understood that very likely his patients were suffering of depression even after being cured of their cancer, because the cancer drug had stopped the newborn neuron to be generated. And it will take time to generate new neurons that reach a normal functions. So collectively, now we think we have enough evidence to say that neurogenesis is a target of choice if we want to improve memory formation or mood, or even prevent their decline associated with aging or associated with stress. So the next question is, can we control neurogenesis? The answer is yes. And we are going to do now a little quiz. So I'm going to give you a set of behavior and activity, and you tell me if you think they will increase neurogenesis or if they will decrease neurogenesis. Are we ready? Okay, let's go. So what about learning? Increasing? Yes. So learning will increase the production of these new neurons. How about stress? Yes, stress will decrease the production of new neurons in the hippocampus. How about sleep deprivation? Indeed, it will decrease.
Now keep in mind over here, the stress, again, how you frame it is important over here. The stress where it's debilitating and negative in terms of how you frame it, right? That would be a decrease. So in the previous session, we had a video where there was two different stresses that were discussed. And the first one was talking about how there was negative stress and so on, right? So this is sort of the negative stress over here also that she's referring to. Obviously positive stress, sort of like a challenge and stuff, but that can actually be framed as learning experiences and like, you know, growth and development and so on. In that case, the brain would actually probably do neurogenesis and it would increase that.
Neurogenesis. How about sex? Oh, wow. Yes, you're right. It will increase the production of new neurons. However, it's all about balance here. We don't want to fall in a situation about too much sex leading to sleep deprivations. So how about getting older? So neurogenesis rate will decrease as we get older, but this is still occurring. And then finally, how about running? So I will let you judge that one by yourself. So this is one of the first studies that was carried out by one of my mentors, Rusty Gage from the Salk Institute, showing that the environment can have an impact on the production of new neurons. And here you see a section of the hippocampus of a mouse that had no running wheel in its cage. And the little black dot you see are actually newborn neurons to be. And now you see a section of the hippocampus of a mouse that had a running wheel in its cage. So you see the massive increase of the black dots representing the new neurons to be. So activity impacts on neurogenesis, but that's not all. What you eat will have an effect on the production of new neuron in the hippocampus. So here we have a sample of diet on nutrients that have been shown to have.
Okay, so just for a second, look at all of these things. You'll see some things over here that are, you know, focused on those things that can help a lot.
Efficacy. And I'm just going to point a few out to you. So calorie restriction of 20 to 30% will increase neurogenesis. Intermittent fasting, so spacing the time between your meal, will increase neurogenesis. Intake of flavonoid, which is contained in dark chocolate or blueberry, will increase neurogenesis. Omega-3 fatty acids present in fatty fish like salmon will increase the production of these minerals. Conversely, a diet rich in high saturated fat will have a negative impact on neurogenesis. Ethanol, intake of alcohol, will decrease neurogenesis. However, not everything is lost. Resveratrol, which is contained in red wine, has been shown to promote the survival of these new neurons. So next time you're at a dinner party, you might want to reach for this possibly neurogenesis neutral drink. And then finally, let me point out the last one, a quirky one. So Japanese groups are fascinated about food textures, and they have shown that actually soft diet impairs neurogenesis as opposed to food that require mastication, chewing, or crunchy food. So all of this data, where we need to look at the cellular level, have been generated using animal models. But these diets have also been given to human participants. And what we could see is that the diet modulates memory and mood in the same direction as it modulates neurogenesis, such as calorie restriction will improve memory capacity, whereas high-fat diet will exacerbate symptoms of depression, as opposed to omega-3 fatty acid, which increase neurogenesis.
So notice over here, omega-3 fats are actually like, you know, fat, right? Because these are fatty acids, that's fat, right? If you have, for example, salmon, and you get like really fatty salmon and stuff like that, this is actually good then, right? As opposed to the kind of negative fat, the bad fat stuff. So you just have to understand the quality of fat over here. Omega-3 is coming from salmon fat, but at the same time, there's also, and then like if you have nuts, for example, these are healthy fats, right? But then there's that negative, there's a bad fat. So fat in itself is not the problem. It's the type of fat that you're eating that's the problem. Okay, so to keep that in mind over here. Even saturated fats can be beneficial for you. Some of the foods that you're going to eat and stuff are going to have that. But at the same time, you want to avoid certain types. For example, trans fat, for example, is something that we've been discussing that could be potentially really bad for you. Also, I believe hydrogenated oils and stuff like that, when they get cooked and stuff like that, like when they get cooked, they also get turned into like a type where it's bad for you. So just keep in mind that it's not necessarily the fat itself that's bad, it's the quality or the type of fat that we're talking about over here.
Yes, and also help to decrease the symptom of depression. So we think that the effect of diet on mental health, on memory and mood is actually mediated by the production of the new neuron in the hippocampus. And it's not only what you eat, but it's also the texture of the food when you eat it and how much of it you eat. On our side, neuroscientists interested in neurogenesis, we need to understand better the function of these new neurons and how we can control their survival and their production. We also need to find a way how to protect the neurogenesis of Robert's patients. And on your side, I leave you in charge with your neurogenesis. Thank you.
Fantastic research, Andre. Now, I told you you changed my life. I now eat a lot of blueberries. Right. I'm really interested in the running thing. Okay, do I have to run? Right? Or is it really just about aerobic exercise, getting oxygen to the brain? Could it be any kind of vigorous exercise?
So for the moment, we can't really say if it's just the running itself, but we think that anything that indeed will increase the production or moving the blood flow to the brain, should be beneficial.
Right, so I don't have to get a running wheel in my office.
No, you don't.
A lot of relief. Okay, that's wonderful. Sophie, Jimmy, thank you so much.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you.
Okay, so thoughts on that one?
It's very interesting research. I find it interesting how science will change over time, and that many times it just comes back around into a circle, or they start finding evidence that supports common sense. So it's just very interesting.
Yeah, and imagine like if you initially, there had some research that was indicating potentially that there was no neurogenesis, for example, in adult brains, and then people started thinking like that, and now the entire society goes like that. But then there were certain assumptions that they had made that limited the study in a certain way, and then it just didn't reach everyone and so on, until later on they actually looked back and say, wait, what about this? They considered a different factor. They didn't assume an assumption that they had assumed initially. And then they started realizing, wait a minute, okay, that's not true, and the actual evidence is showing contrary to this. Maybe we had an assumption that didn't account for certain things, and so our assumption was wrong. But then an entire society was impacted with this sort of mindset and stuff, right? And so then imagine how many people would have gotten impacted negatively like this. So then they might be treating people with the wrong assumption, with the wrong understanding, and that can, you can see how much harm that could potentially cause people. I am not, again, definitely not saying that science is not useful, and it should be avoided and stuff, because that would not be a smart idea. But at the same time, I am saying, just keep in mind that just because something is coming out, it doesn't necessarily guarantee something at the moment. There might be some things to consider. There's more investigation that needs to be done, and we shouldn't become too rigid just yet in like any concept and stuff like that, unless we know more details and all that stuff, right? And at the same time also, she mentioned a lot about how depression and neurogenesis are indirectly related or inversely related. Neurogenesis, could be something that helps in terms of decreasing depression and so on, but it also could be something where depression is negatively impacting neurogenesis. And if depression is connected also to your mindset and your social environment and all that stuff, right? And then memory loss and stuff is sort of associated with potentially with traumatic experiences, and trauma could be perceived or it could be real. It could be that you misunderstood an entire situation and you thought something bad was happening when actually it wasn't happening like that, and then you start feeling negative about the situation. And in that case, you can also go into depression and so on. So with all of this in mind, potentially things like Alzheimer's, for example, or other other disease diseases or conditions and so on, may not be as they're being thought of. So that gives a lot of hope to families and people and stuff like that are going through these kinds of things. That maybe it's not a permanent, some of the things that they're thinking are permanent, irreversible diseases and stuff, may actually not be like that. Maybe there is hope in that. Maybe they actually can be reversible. Maybe there are certain things that we have not yet considered, or we might find out in the future, and then we might realize how much more, how much potentially harm that we might have done by assuming certain things, right? So I just want to mention these things over here, that it seems that that function that she was mentioning, where neurogenesis and like antidepressive medication could actually help kind of prevent the blockage of neurogenesis and so on, and all of these things, and it can increase like learning and memory and all that stuff. Just putting everything in context, when we put everything back in their proper places, like the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prescribed us, then we can have a society where we can actually function properly and we can actually be thriving, even if we don't understand exactly how everything works. Just because some people don't want to accept certain things doesn't mean that those things are wrong or not correct or whatever, right? In certain cases, if something is working, we don't have to press the reset button and say, okay, now until we understand exactly how this works or why it works and stuff, we're not going to implement it. If something is working, we let it keep working and stuff, right? But then the question comes in, okay, well, how do we know if something is working or not? And so on, because again, if you don't have a society that has a set standard moral that is independent of the people that are in it, meaning it's not developed by them, then if we don't have something like that, then you can be confused and you don't have a purpose and you don't have clarity and you don't have anything going on. It's just sort of a confusion. So in that case, it makes sense for people to keep pressing the reset button over and over again, and instead of making progress, we keep regressing or going in cycles throughout history and so on. So just some reflections of that. Any other thoughts on that one? Okay, so we'll go ahead and do this one then.
I used to think the whole purpose of life was pursuing happiness. Everyone said the path to happiness was success, so I searched for that ideal job, that perfect boyfriend, that beautiful apartment. But instead of ever feeling fulfilled, I felt anxious and adrift. And I wasn't alone. My friends, they struggled with this too. Eventually, I decided to go to graduate school for positive psychology to learn what truly makes people happy. But what I discovered there changed my life. The data showed that chasing happiness can make people unhappy. And what really struck me was this. The suicide rate has been rising around the world, and it recently reached a 30-year high in America. Even though life is getting objectively better by nearly every conceivable standard, more people feel hopeless, depressed, and alone. There's an emptiness gnawing away at people, and you don't have to be clinically depressed to feel it. Sooner or later, I think we all wonder, is this all there is? And according to the research, what predicts this despair is not a lack of happiness. It's a lack of something else, a lack of having meaning in life. But that raised some questions for me. Is there more to life than being happy? And what's the difference between being happy and having meaning in life? Many psychologists define happiness as a state of comfort and ease, feeling good in the moment. Meaning, though, is deeper. The renowned psychologist Martin Seligman says meaning comes from belonging to and serving something beyond yourself.
Okay, 2 points over here. The definition of happiness is something that's not obviously agreed upon by anyone. So there's a lot of different definitions. So when she's mentioning this, she's also sort of highlighting this indirectly. Number 2, Martin Seligman is the one that we've been talking about when it comes to positive psychology and the learned helplessness. The phenomenon that he did, with the dogs and so on, the study that he did with the three sets of dogs and so on. So it's about him, right? This is the one mentioning. I think he was leading the American Psychology Association, I think, in the 90s, and he introduced the idea of positive psychology and so on, and so on. So obviously, if I'm saying something that is not factual, anybody can correct me, inshallah. But in the meantime, as far as I remember, these are the the dates and the person associated with learned helplessness and positive psychology and all that stuff.
And from developing the best within you. Our culture is obsessed with happiness, but I came to see that seeking meaning is the more fulfilling path. And the studies showed that people who have meaning in life, they're more resilient, they do better in school and at work, and they even live longer. So this all made me wonder, how can we each live more meaningfully? To find out, I spent 5 years interviewing hundreds of people and reading through thousands of pages of psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy. Bringing it all together, I found that there are what I call 4 pillars of a meaningful life, and we can each create lives of meaning by building some or all of these pillars in our lives. The first pillar is belonging. Belonging comes from being in relationships where you're valued for who you are intrinsically and where you value others as well.
So consider here some of the things that Islam prescribes. For example, a sense of brotherhood and unity, looking out for each other, being there, the rights that we have on each other in terms of when we get sick, for example, we have a right that other people should visit us. When we have weddings or parties or invitations, it's like happy events, we or whatever, especially like when it comes to weddings, for example, when a person invites us, we should we should, or they have a right on us that we should visit them and so on. When a person passes away, all of that stuff is a sense of belonging, working together and so on. So just keep in mind these things as she's mentioning them.
But some groups and relationships deliver a cheap form of belonging. You're valued for what you believe, for who you hate, not for who you are. True belonging springs from love. It lives in moments among individuals, and it's a choice. You can choose to cultivate belonging with others. Here's an example. Each morning, my friend Jonathan buys a newspaper from the same street vendor in New York. They don't just conduct a transaction, though. They take a moment to slow down, talk, and treat each other like humans. But one time, Jonathan didn't have the right change, and the vendor said, "Don't worry about it." But Jonathan insisted on paying, so he went to the store and bought something he didn't need to make change. But when he gave the money to the vendor drew back. He was hurt. He was trying to do something kind, but Jonathan had rejected him. I think we all reject people in small ways like this without realizing it. I do. I'll walk by someone I know and barely acknowledge them. I'll check my phone when someone's talking to me. These acts devalue others. They make them feel invisible and unworthy. But when you lead with love, you create a bond that lifts each of you up. For many people, belonging is the most essential source of meaning, those bonds to family and friends. For others, the key to meaning is the second pillar, purpose. Now, finding your purpose is not the same thing as finding that job that makes you happy. Purpose is less about what you want than about what you give. A hospital custodian told me her purpose is healing sick people.
Notice the difference of belonging and purpose.
Many parents tell me, my purpose is raising my children. The key to purpose is using your strengths to serve others.
So notice this over here. What is unique about us that we bring to the table? And again, like just our experiences. Every person is unique in the sense that they have different sets of total experiences and understandings and so on. So each of us brings something to the table that nobody else is able to bring because of the fact that we are a different, a completely unique individual, right? We are part of a community, but each of our differences allow us slightly different perspectives in terms of how to approach different things and so on. So we have a comprehensive understanding of how to navigate things when we work together. So the idea of diversity can be a good thing, inshallah, in these kinds of cases. Now, in some cases, differing ideas and so on may not necessarily be the great. There are certain things where there are bad ideas or bad opinions or whatever versus good ones and so on. But this is like just keep in mind that there is some general idea here that we have strengths that we bring to the table with which we bring benefit to others and so on, or we serve others or help others or interact with others or whatever. And this is actually what makes us also feel like we belong.
Of course, for many of us, that happens through work. That's how we contribute and feel needed. But that also means that issues like disengagement at work, unemployment, low labor force participation, these aren't just economic problems, they're existential ones too. Without something worthwhile to do, people flounder. Of course, you don't have to find purpose at work, but purpose gives you something to live for, some why that drives you forward. The third pillar of meaning is also about stepping beyond yourself, but in a completely different way. Transcendence. Transcendent states are those rare moments when you're lifted above the hustle and bustle of daily life. Your sense of self fades away and you feel connected to a higher reality. For one person I talked to, transcendence came from seeing art. For another person, it was at church.
So notice over here, feeling like you're part of a bigger picture, a bigger concept, or something bigger than yourself, right? And it makes you feel more positive and, optimistic and empowered بإذن الله, right? In this case, if we connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we feel that kind of empowerment. We feel that we, belong to something, like we're part of something bigger than just a little tiny individual that we might be relative to everyone else. And then we look at working with other people as competition. You don't compete with others in a negative way. You actually consider that as a team thing, right? So you're still doing your part, you're still doing the extra efforts and so on, but you're framing it as not as a competition between you guys, right? Instead, you're framing it as a teamwork. So the same thing, you're just framing it differently. You're still putting the hard work, you're still excelling, you're pushing hard and stuff, whatever. But in one case, you're actually feeling like you're competing against the other people, versus in the other case, you actually feel like you're working with the other people instead of against the other people.
For me, I'm a writer, and it happens through writing. Sometimes I get so in the zone that I lose all sense of time and place. And these transcendent experiences can change you. One study had students look up at 200 feet tall eucalyptus trees for 1 minute. But afterwards, they felt less self-centered, and they even behaved more generously when given the chance to help someone. Belonging, purpose, transcendence. Now, the fourth pillar of meaning I found tends to surprise people. The fourth pillar is storytelling, the story you tell yourself about yourself. Creating a narrative from the events of your life brings clarity. It helps you understand how you became you. But we don't always realize that we're the authors of our stories and can change the way we're telling them. Your life isn't just a list of events. You can edit, interpret, and retell your story, even as you're constrained by the facts. I met a young man named Emeka who'd been paralyzed playing football. After his injury, Emeka told himself, "My life was great playing football, but now, look at me." People who tell stories like this, "My life was good, now it's bad," they tend to be more anxious and depressed. And that.
So framing your situation, right? People who go through negative experiences in the past, if they look at them and then actually find a positive way to frame them, they're not going to look at it in a negative way. They're not going to be held back with negative baggage that we've discussed in the past.
Was Emeka for a while. But with time, he started to weave a different story. His new story was, "Before my injury, my life was purposeless. I partied a lot and was a pretty selfish guy. But my injury made me realize I could be a better man." That edit to his story changed Emeka's life. After telling the new story to himself, Emeka started mentoring kids, and he discovered what his purpose was: serving others. The psychologist Dan McAdams calls this a redemptive story, where the bad is redeemed by the good. People leading meaningful lives, he's found, they tend to tell stories about their lives defined by redemption, growth, and love. But what makes people change their stories? Some people get help from a therapist, but you can do it on your own too, just by reflecting on your life thoughtfully. How your defining experiences shaped you, what you lost, what you gained. That's what Emeka did. You won't change your story overnight. It could take years and be painful. After all, we've all suffered and we all struggle. But embracing those painful memories can lead to new insights and wisdom, to finding that good that sustains you. Belonging, purpose, transcendence, storytelling. Those are the four pillars of meaning. When I was younger, I was lucky enough to be surrounded by all of the pillars. My parents ran a Sufi meeting house from our home in Montreal. Sufism is a spiritual practice associated with the whirling dervishes and the poet Rumi. Twice a week, Sufis would come to our home to meditate, drink Persian tea, and share stories. Their practice also involved serving all of creation through small acts of love, which meant being kind even when people wronged you. But it gave them a purpose: to rein in the ego. Eventually, I left home for college, and without the daily grounding of Sufism in my life, I felt unmoored, and I started searching for those things that make life worth living. That's what set me on this journey. Looking back, I now realize that the Sufi house had a real culture of meaning. The pillars were part of the architecture, and the presence of the pillars helped us all live more deeply. Of course, the same principle applies in other strong communities as well, good ones and bad ones. Gangs, cults, these are cultures of meaning that use the pillars and give people something to live and die for. But that's exactly why we as a society must offer better alternatives. We need to build these pillars within our families and our institutions to help people become their best selves. But living a meaningful life takes work. It's an ongoing process. As each day goes by, we're constantly creating our lives, adding to our story. And sometimes we can get off track. Whenever that happens to me, I remember a powerful experience I had with my father. Several months after I graduated from college, my dad had a massive heart attack that should have killed him. He survived, and when I asked him what was going through his mind as he faced death, he said all he could think about was needing to live so he could be there for my brother and me, and this gave him the will to fight for life. When he went under anesthesia for emergency surgery, instead of counting backwards from 10, he repeated our names like a mantra. He wanted our names to be the last words he spoke on earth if he died. My dad is a carpenter and a Sufi. It's a humble life, but a good life. Lying there facing death, he had a reason to live, love. His sense of belonging within his family, his purpose as a dad, his transcendent meditation repeating our names, these, he says, are the reasons why he survived. That's the story he tells himself. That's the power of meaning. Happiness comes and goes, but when life is really good and when things are really bad, having meaning gives you something to hold on to. Thank you.
Okay, thoughts on that? By the way, she mentioned Sufis and so on. Obviously, there's a lot more. She mentioned a certain aspect of it in a certain context, so I don't want people to think that this is what it is and so on. I didn't want to comment on that beyond that, but just kind of, if anybody was confused, I don't want it to seem like, you know, like this simplified sort of very specific one context type like a presentation is what is describing the entire thing. However, I think for the purposes of her presentation, she didn't need to go into much details and stuff. She was just talking about the concept of having meaning and purpose and so on, in a particular context. And so that's why when she mentions gangs and cults and so on, she connects that they have the same sort of, you know, structure and dynamic and stuff like that. And then she proposes that maybe in communities and families and so on, we can have something like that as well built into those dynamics. So just the idea of how these things work, and she was giving an example of one example of where these things are found. So that's why I don't think that I need to go into details about that. She was just using that by way of example and not actually discussing Sufism as a concept and so on and stuff like that. So I hope whoever's watching understands why that discussion is not taking place, and why they shouldn't be offended if something is, you know, presented in a certain way, because that wasn't the objective. Her objective was not to talk about Sufism. It was the idea of just using that as an example in her context, her specific experience, you know, in the context of her discussion about the four pillars. So I hope that makes sense. In the meantime, other questions or any comments that people have on this video? Okay, if there's no comments, maybe we'll go back to here. Any thoughts on these answers or these questions? And just in case you didn't notice, I did add clarity under here. So it's communication, community, and clarity. Any thoughts or reflections?
I don't think calm is the same as contentment. I think calm is just the definition of the outward, what's outwardly apparent to somebody's manner. It does not necessarily mean that they are content, because inside they may feel very, maybe very turbulent inside. Or somebody is just resigned to the way things are rather than being content with the way things are.
Yeah.
I think having a meaning or purpose in life can absolutely help with contentment, because there is, I would say most people have a need to be useful. Or I should say the people who have the need to feel useful, when they have a purpose or when they have a mission, then that can make them feel more content that they are actually doing something to help somebody. I mean, you see this, right, with even people who are doing animal rescues. You know, they're not, maybe not actually helping human beings directly, but they're helping animals. And they tend, if you ever watch videos of animal rescuers, their surroundings are not necessarily clean or tidy or fancy, or they may not have a lot of money, but they seem very content and they derive a lot of happiness from having that purpose of taking care of animals and rescuing them, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think purpose varies for people. Some people are people, so they would prefer to deal with people, and others are more introverted, and they're not going out there and dealing with people directly, but they may be doing things behind the scenes, or they have a more private purpose or meaning.
Can there be people that are both?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, so context specific, depending on the context.
Right. Absolutely.
And then people who are people, are those people people because that's who they are, in the sense that this is their purpose, they enjoy this? Or can there be people who are people because of the fact that they might need extra, they might not have a certain, they might have like a certain like need in terms of they're not feeling that they're belonging and so on. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, I think there are people who keep a lot of people around them because they like that support, but that may not be their purpose, or that may not be the thing that drives them.
Yeah, I know somebody, for example, or a few people who are people because it's a way to cope with some stress or depression that they might be going through.
Right.
So this is just like, when they feel like people are talking to them or they're talking to people and stuff, then it makes it sort of like they can forget about their stress, or during the times that they're having these interactions and not thinking about those things that are haunting them, that are resolved and so on. And then during COVID-19, for example, when that peopleness was sort of limited, then that depression started hitting home, and it became really clear and vivid, and they had to come face to face with it. And so that was something that I've actually like got to, or those people got to see, and they were communicating that with me, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So something else to keep in mind. Like there's a lot of this kind of stuff. There's all of these dynamics that are playing out. But ultimately, if we understand some basic things that need to be, in people's lives, without which things are going to go off track, then we can help kind of put those things back in place, and then kind of help them, get it more like a happy life or content life or whatever, just because of the fact that things are put back in place. So hikmah is defined as like right in the right time or the right place and stuff. Right? Pretty much like putting things in their proper places, essentially, right? And justice involves the same thing, putting things in the right places instead of returning the rights to people that were taken away from them or that they weren't getting. So giving back the rights of people is kind of putting the rights back in their proper places, or giving them to their owners and so on. So in this context, when in life, when certain needs of life are not being met, or they're not being provided, or they're absent in a person's life, things can kind of go off track and stuff, right? But if we help a person with those things, then they get back on track. So all of these things, looking at Islam and how Allah Ta'ala has, given us all these things, right? And given us clarity, given us the idea of community and communication and all of these concepts, it really helps me. It kind of gave me this perspective, ultimately, that Islam is a powerful framework of mind, because it helps you navigate any context you might ever come across, and it gives you basic tools that are going to help you stay on track and actually feel happy and content, even if you don't understand how they're working or why they're working and stuff, right? So you don't have to be a genius and stuff to understand or to actually feel happy or content. You could be a Bedouin who, for example, in this case, assuming a Bedouin has gotten education, whatever. So let's say there's something like that. You could be like in 7th or 8th century, Arabia, if you may, a Bedouin that's just that traversing random places, that going from one place to another and stuff, right? And this person right here could be happy and content by having the right things in their places, just like a person in the next 500 years might be using the same basic principles and finding happiness in a more sophisticated and complex context, right? So Islam gives you all of these basic things that you need, whether you need understand them or not. That's not really the issue. The issue is, ultimately, do you have what you need, right? In terms of your contentment and all that stuff. If you don't have those things, then moving forward, you're going to be depressed, and you could be you can have negative experiences and so on. So Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala is intending that you go to Jannah. He gives you a path that is like a sort of like a shortcut or an easy way, or like a more satisfying path to while you're traveling the dunya, right? So how the hadith talks about how that the Muslim is like a habir sabil. He's like a person traveling a road or whatever and stuff, right? And so if we understand that, we understand that our purpose, or what we're supposed to do, is sort of just get through this life, and contribute to our context as much as we can, right? With basic things that we need to be happy and content in this life, and then we can get to the hereafter. Then that kind of simplifies everything for us, gives us happiness and contentment, and we let go of control where we don't have control, and then in that case, again, we feel more contentment and more satisfaction and more peace of mind, because we're not chasing after things that we don't have control over. We're content with the way that things are working, because we know Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala is overseeing everything, and that's it. Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala tells us to do something. As long as we're doing our part in terms of what we have control over, we're good to go. Anything that we don't have control over, we sort of let Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala handle it, because there is no one better who can handle whatever it is that I'm worried about other than Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, right? So that if I have control over something, then I'll do my part, and if I don't have control over something, then there is someone who is better than me in terms of oversight and control and all that, that I can let go of control to. I don't have to say I need to have control over it, because in those things that I don't have control over, someone who's better than me in all these areas is already overseeing those things and stuff. So if I let go of those things, I'm actually doing a favor to everything else around me, right? So if we think about it like that, it makes it a lot easier for us, a lot more simplified, a lot less stressful, and so on. We can navigate life like that. Be it
Yeah, totally agree. Being able to give up the idea that we control things, very freeing.
Any additional thoughts or comments or anything related to this? Anything that we would like to explore a little bit more, or anything?
I think that the different phases of life, you have different definitions of what is contentment and what is happiness and what is purpose, and so I think that those are probably vulnerable times for people, whether that's like right after high school or right after college or midlife or after traumatic events. They say the big stressors are birth, marriage, divorce, and then death. So then, of course, aging, passing certain times of your life. So I think being able to change your mindset and to have that support system around is a very important part, and have those reminders of the people who can remind you that, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that He's the one who's planning everything, and everything is running according to His plan. And that we do what we can to make the best impact in this life that we can. Yeah. It's not a one-size-fits-all discussion. I think for the message is the same, but the experiences and the wisdom that comes through different, or the wisdom that comes through different experiences changes how the discussion can be held, or how the perspective on different things that happen in life. Alhamdulillah.
And it's important, all this stuff, or for people who are going through these things, if they don't have somebody to help them, like somebody to guide them, somebody to mentor them, whatever, whoever it is, but somebody to kind of really pass this information to them, or kind of help them navigate those times, then in that case people can actually go in a negative headspace potentially, and that's not good. And I think that in some contexts, when people are sort of not, they're sort of open-ended in terms of what people can do, and they don't actually give clear instructions and guidance and simplified stuff, then people can get overwhelmed, and that doesn't actually help in terms of moving forward. So for example, there's a young person might come in and say, I don't know what to do and stuff, and I just want some purpose in my life. I want something, something like that. I just want to do something, I want to feel important, I want to whatever. And then if a person doesn't actually guide you, somebody doesn't actually give you steps moving forward, what are the most important things in life, what is something that's going to fill your heart with contentment and so on, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us that, right? But if we don't have people like that in proper places and stuff, right, then it makes it difficult for us, for the people to actually move forward in a healthy way. So for example, there might be some professions where there is guidance that they might give, but for example, if they don't know about these things, whether they, let's say they haven't studied Deen, or maybe they haven't studied certain things where, the things that Deen talks about, they don't know those things yet, for example, then in that case, they might talk to young people, or they might talk to people going through these traumatic experiences, or whatever it might be, and they might not be able to actually help them, and they might actually confuse them even more by letting the person sort of telling them, okay, you can also do this, and you can do this, and you can do that and stuff, right? But then the person is sort of more confused because they just wanted simplification, and they wanted clarity, and they just wanted somebody to sort of tell them, okay, do this, and then you're going to get this, whatever, right? Instead of that, they get okay, well, what do you want to do and stuff, and and the person is already confused. I think some of those things can actually negatively impact certain things, but I think if we get, train people in the right way, then they can actually benefit, you know, young people or people that are going through these difficult situations in a more, you know, in a more strategic way, in a more practical way, in a more beneficial way, an easier way, and probably in a faster way, you know, so I think that's also something that we can, so some of this discussion can kind of like, you know, lead into those kinds of discussions about what do we need in our communities to help people in these kinds of situations, right? If we understand what is not happening in society the way it should be happening, and as you know, consequently causing all these potential problems and stuff, or these like real problems that are leading people to like extreme situations, then what can we do to bring people back to things that, you know, or bring society back to sort of where it needs to be? What are some things that we could do to help with that, right? So these are, I think this discussion can lead into that discussion of actual action items that we could have, certain programs that we can start, initiatives that we can do, and so on, right? Some things that, you know, to think about as we move forward, inshallah. So all of the stuff that I'm giving is definitely intended to help to be functional and beneficial. So I don't want it to be sort of just, you know, theoretical discussions. All the stuff I'm actually bringing from ground experience and, you know, research and data, all that stuff. But at the same time, I am discussing the broader consequences and implications of this stuff. But at the same time, I also wanted to go back again to the actual groundwork and stuff of that, so that we can actually make progress towards those things that, you know, need to be done. In this case, bringing society back to the place, to a state where it needs to be in, because it seems to be very off track right now in many ways. There are certain things that are doing great, but there are a lot of things that are also not doing great.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of work to be done. And if we can come up with some concrete plans and ideas to move things forward, that would be great.
Any other thoughts or comments or ideas?
Sorry, losing my voice. No, not right now. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and stop, inshallah, with this. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك